In 1989, an Argentine could buy a house with the money in their savings account. By the end of that year, the same money couldn't buy a loaf of bread. That collapse wasn't a one-time accident. It was chapter 6 of a story that started nearly a century earlier and hasn't finished yet. This is Argentina, the 8th largest country on Earth by land, one of the richest nations in the world a century ago. Over the next 20 minutes, we're going to trace exactly how a country this wealthy, this resource-rich, ended up defaulting on its debt 9 separate times. Not the short version. The whole thing. Let's start at the top because you can't understand how far Argentina fell without understanding how high it once stood. In the early 1900s, Argentina was one of the 10 richest countries on Earth per person. Wealthier than France, wealthier than Germany. Buenos Aires was being rebuilt to rival Paris, with wide boulevards and grand opera houses. Immigrants poured in from Italy and Spain by the millions, chasing the same promise people chased in America. Beef and grain exports made Argentina one of the world's great breadbaskets, and for 3 straight decades, its economy grew faster than Canada's and Australia's combined growth rates of the same era. That golden age didn't survive the 20th century's shocks. The Great Depression hit Argentina's export-driven economy hard in the 1930s, and the country responded the way many nations did, turning inward, protecting local industry, and drifting toward the military-influenced politics that would define much of its next 100 years. Out of that instability came the man whose name is still inseparable from Argentine economics today, Juan Domingo Perón, elected president in 1946. In his first 2 years alone, Perón nationalized the central bank and paid off its billion-dollar debt to the Bank of England, nationalized the British and French-owned railways, the merchant marine, the universities, and public utilities, and created a state trading agency called the IAPI to control the export trade in Argentina's beef and grain. In 1947, he launched his first 5-year plan, aimed at building nationalized industry from the ground up. The early results were dramatic. Between 1945 and 1949, average real wages rose by roughly 35%, and labor's share of the country's total income climbed from 40 to 49%, one of the fastest redistributions of national wealth anywhere in the world at the time. Alongside Perón, his wife Evita, pushed hard for social change. On September 23, 1947, Argentine women won the right to vote, due in large part to her campaigning. The following year, she founded the Eva Perón Foundation, which employed some 14,000 workers and distributed 400,000 pairs of shoes, 500,000 sewing machines, and 200,000 cooking pots a year to the poor, becoming the machinery behind Argentina's first truly universal healthcare access. But the foundation had cracks from the start. Perón's protectionism cut Argentina off from international competition, creating industries that were expensive to run and incapable of competing abroad. When global commodity prices fell after 1948, the IAPI began demanding such extortionate prices from Argentine farmers for their own crops that the country lost a large share of its foreign export markets entirely. Perón, who had once publicly declared he would cut off his hand before accepting a loan, was forced by 1950 to quietly send envoys to Washington for a $125 million line of credit on tough terms. Rising wages were now outpacing productivity. Inflation began climbing, and the government's own stabilization attempts, tighter money, spending cuts, higher taxes, came too late to reverse the damage. By 1955, economic strain and mounting opposition from the military and the church culminated in a coup that sent Perón into exile. What followed was 2 decades of chronic instability. Between 1955 and 1976, Argentina cycled through repeated military and civilian governments, each trying a different fix, none lasting long enough to see it through. Perón himself returned briefly to the presidency in 1973 before his death in 1974, and the economic turmoil of that second Peronist period set the stage for what came next. In 1976, the military seized power again, this time launching what became known as the Dirty War, a brutal campaign to eliminate political opposition, particularly Perón's remaining supporters, that would leave thousands of Argentines dead or disappeared. The junta appointed a businessman economist named José Alfredo Martínez de Hoz as Minister of Economy, and his policies would define the regime's economic legacy. He initially succeeded in cutting inflation from over 440% in 1976 down to under 88% by 1978 through aggressive liberalization of trade and financial markets. But the cost was steep. Real wages fell by roughly a fifth to two-fifths, depending on the sector, and industrial output stagnated as cheaper imports flooded in. To manage the currency, Martínez de Hoz introduced a policy nicknamed La Tablita, a pre-announced, gradually shrinking schedule of currency devaluations meant to convince markets inflation was coming under control. Instead, it invited a wave of foreign borrowing and financial speculation. Argentina's gross external debt exploded from $9.7 billion in 1976 to over $35 billion within just a few years. The foundation of a debt burden the country would still be wrestling with 2 decades later. The dictatorship's economic failures were compounded by a catastrophic political miscalculation: the 1982 war with the United Kingdom over the Falkland Islands, known in Argentina as the Malvinas. The military junta, hoping to rally public support amid economic collapse, invaded the islands and lost decisively within 10 weeks. The defeat discredited the regime entirely and accelerated its collapse. By 1983, annual inflation had reached 434%, and Argentina returned to civilian democracy, inheriting an economy already in ruins. That inheritance is exactly where our next chapter begins. In 1989, that inherited chronic inflation spiraled completely out of control, over 3,000% for the year, with the worst months running at an annualized rate above 20,000%. Prices in supermarkets changed multiple times a day. Workers were paid twice a month because their wages would lose real value if they waited any longer. The crisis was so severe that President Raúl Alfonsín could not finish his term, resigning 5 months early amid riots and looting in several major cities. The government's answer was drastic: throw out the currency entirely and start over. A new peso was introduced, worth 10,000 of the old ones. It was the 4th currency Argentina had introduced in the 20th century alone, and it would not be the last. The following government tried something bold to make this new currency trustworthy: the Convertibility Plan of 1991. Every peso in circulation would be backed 1-to-1 by a US dollar sitting in the central bank's reserves, by law. For years, it worked almost like magic. Monthly inflation of 27% collapsed to under 3% within months, and stayed low for most of the decade. But a currency board like this has a hidden cost. The government loses the ability to respond to a crisis by adjusting its own currency. When neighboring economies devalued and global investors grew nervous in the late 1990s, Argentina couldn't soften the blow. It could only tighten and wait, while unemployment and poverty quietly climbed year after year. By December 2001, the strain had become unbearable. On December 3rd, the government imposed what became known as the corralito, a hard limit of 1,000 pesos per month that anyone could withdraw from their own bank account. Riots broke out across the country. Within 2 weeks, the president resigned, and Argentina cycled through 5 different presidents in 10 days trying to find anyone willing to take on the crisis. On the final day of that year, Argentina defaulted on $81.8 billion in bonds, part of a broader default totaling nearly $95 billion. At the time, the largest sovereign default in world history, later surpassed only by Greece, more than a decade afterward. The human cost was staggering. Unemployment, which had been 12.4% in 1998, climbed past 23% by 2002. The poverty rate rose from under 26% in 1998 to above 57% at the crisis's peak. The peso, once locked at parity with the dollar, lost roughly 3/4 of its value within months. And yet, the years that followed tell a part of this story that's often left out entirely. Nestor Kirchner, a relatively obscure provincial governor, rose to the presidency in 2003 out of the wreckage of the 2001 collapse. Freed from the currency peg and helped by a boom in global commodity prices, Argentina's economy grew at an average of roughly 8% a year from 2003 to 2011. Argentina even used part of that recovery to pay off its remaining IMF debt entirely in 2006. A symbolic declaration of independence from the institution many Argentines blamed for the crisis. Poverty, which had spiked above 50% after the default, fell dramatically over the following years. But the recovery had a manufactured shine to it. In 2007, Nestor Kirchner's government fired officials at INDEC, the National Statistics Agency, after they refused to alter the methodology used to calculate inflation. From that point forward, independent economists routinely estimated Argentina's real inflation rate at more than double what the government officially reported. When Nestor's wife, Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, succeeded him as president in 2007, she deepened the same playbook, nationalizing private pension funds in 2008 to free up cash for public spending, and in 2012, renationalizing the energy company YPF, seized back from its Spanish owners, Repsol. Capital flight reached an estimated $11 billion in 2010 alone, as investors grew wary of where the country's finances really stood. Nestor Kirchner died suddenly of a heart attack in October 2010, but the economic model he'd built continued under Cristina for 5 more years. Price controls, subsidized utilities, and understated inflation propped up for as long as commodity export revenue could cover the gap. By the time the next crisis hit, many of the same fiscal habits that caused 2001 had quietly returned, just wearing a different name. In 2014, Argentina defaulted again, this time not from running out of money, but from a courtroom fight. A small group of investors who had refused the 2001 restructuring, nicknamed the Vulture Funds by Argentina, won a U.S. court ruling demanding full payment before Argentina could pay anyone else. Argentina refused on principle and technically defaulted a second time on the very same debt it thought it had already resolved. In 2018, sudden capital flight forced the peso to lose roughly half its value against the dollar in a matter of months, pushing Argentina into a record-breaking $57 billion bailout from the International Monetary Fund, the largest loan in the fund's history at the time. Then came 2020, Argentina's 9th sovereign default, restructuring $65 billion in debt in the middle of a global pandemic. By 2023, annual inflation hit 211%. That crisis brought Argentina to its most radical experiment yet. In December 2023, voters elected Javier Milei, a libertarian economist who campaigned wielding a chainsaw at rallies as a symbol of the cuts he promised to make. Milei's first move was an overnight 54% devaluation of the peso. He cut government ministries from 18 down to 9, eliminated roughly 52,000 public sector jobs, and shut down the National Tax Agency entirely, replacing it with a smaller one. The short-term pain was severe. Poverty, which stood at 41.7% when Milei took office, spiked as high as 57% within his first 2 months, the sharpest jump in 2 decades. But by the end of 2024, Argentina had posted its first fiscal surplus in over a decade, and by the first half of 2025, poverty had fallen to roughly 31.6%, the lowest level since 2018. Monthly inflation, which had peaked above 25% the month Milei took office, fell to as low as 1.5% by mid-2025, a 5-year low. In April 2025, Argentina lifted the currency controls that had restricted ordinary citizens from freely buying dollars for years. That October, Milei's party won a landslide in the midterm elections, doubling its seats in Congress and clearing the way for deeper reforms, backed by a further $40 billion in U.S. financial support. Whether this is the moment the cycle finally breaks, or simply the next chapter in a story that has repeated 9 times already, is a question nobody can answer yet. So why does a country this large, this resource-rich, keep landing in the same place? The honest answer is contested even among economists. Some trace it all the way back to Perón, a political tradition of spending generously to win public loyalty, regardless of what the country could actually afford. Others point to Argentina's heavy reliance on commodity exports, leaving it exposed every time global prices shift. The International Monetary Fund's own internal review later admitted it had supported Argentina's fixed exchange rate for too long during the 1990s and had been too lenient on the country's growing deficits. Most economists agree the truth is a mix of all of it, compounded across generations, hardened into political habits that outlast any single president. Here's what makes Argentina different from almost anywhere else. Its people adapted around the instability itself. Many Argentines stopped trusting their own currency entirely. Savings get converted to US dollars the moment a paycheck arrives. Dollars kept in cash, sometimes literally hidden in the walls of homes, because trusting a bank has burned people too many times before. Argentines are now some of the largest holders of physical US dollars outside the United States itself, a country effectively running 2 currencies at once, one official, one real. Argentina hasn't defaulted 9 times because it lacks resources, people, or ambition. It's collapsed because trust, in a currency, in a government's promises, is the hardest thing in the world to rebuild once it's broken. From Perón's factories to a chainsaw-wielding economist a century later, Argentina keeps searching for the version of itself it lost somewhere around 1930 and hasn't found its way back yet. Every claim in this video is independently sourced. Full source list in the description. Every country has a story like this one. We tell them all, every week, from the biggest nations to the smallest islands. Subscribe. The next one might be about the country you least expect.